Las Vegas, 1968. The neon lights of the Strip shimmered like a restless ocean, reflecting off polished car windows and the glossy marble floors of the casinos. Inside the legendary Sands Hotel, the air smelled of expensive cigars, whiskey, the electric tension of a night that promised unforgettable entertainment. The main lounge was packed. Movie stars, musicians, mob, connected businessmen, journalists hoping to catch a glimpse of greatness. On the stage stood a man who made the entire room feel like a living room. Dean Martin. He leaned casually against the microphone stand, a glass of whiskey in his hand, smiling that famous crooked smile. The audience loved him. Not because he tried too hard, but because he never seemed to try at all. He sang smoothly. He joked lazily. He looked like a man who was permanently relaxed in a world full of people trying desperately to impress each other. Tonight, however, the audience had an extra surprise guest sitting at the front table. Clint Eastwood. At that time, Eastwood was becoming one of Hollywood's fastest-rising stars. Tall, sharp-jawed, and quiet, he carried an intensity that made people slightly nervous around him. Wasn't loud, he didn't laugh easily. But when he spoke, people listened. Next to him sat several producers, a few studio executives, and a group of Vegas regulars who were already 3 drinks deep. Dean spotted him almost immediately. He raised his glass. "Well, look who wandered into my show," Dean said with a lazy grin. The crowd turned toward Clint. Applause rolled across the room. Dean squinted dramatically. Clint Eastwood. Ladies and gentlemen, the applause grew louder. Dean tilted his head. "You know," he continued, "I always wondered what it'd be like if a cowboy walked into a casino and actually smiled." The room burst into laughter. Even Clint smiled slightly. Dean took a sip of whiskey. "But Clint don't smile much," he added. "That's because if he smiles, 3 bandits drop dead somewhere." More laughter. Clint nodded politely. The playful energy filled the room like warm sunlight. Dean continued his performance, singing, joking, telling stories about Hollywood and Vegas. Everything felt effortless. But then something shifted. Halfway through the show, Clint stood up. He had been quiet all evening, listening more than talking. Now he raised his glass toward the stage. "Dean," he called out. Dean looked down. "Well, if it ain't the tallest cowboy in California," the audience chuckled. Clint spoke calmly. "You've been making jokes about everyone tonight," Dean shrugged. "It's my job." Clint nodded. "Well, I got one for you." The crowd leaned forward. Clint's voice remained steady. "I heard your brother used to tell better jokes than you." A few people laughed. Dean smiled politely. But Clint wasn't finished. "Too bad he isn't around anymore," Clint added. For a moment, the room froze. The laughter died instantly. Dean Martin's brother William had died years earlier. Most people in the room knew that, but nobody talked about it. Dean had rarely mentioned him publicly. And suddenly the joke didn't feel like a joke. It felt like someone had accidentally stepped on broken glass. The silence was heavy. Even the band stopped moving. Clint didn't seem to realize the weight of what he had said. He simply took a sip of his drink. Dean stood on stage, still holding the microphone. The entire room watched him. Some people expected anger. Others expected a sharp comeback. Vegas performers were famous for brutal humor. But Dean Martin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slowly set his glass down. He looked at Clint, not with anger, not with embarrassment, but with a strange calm. The kind of calm that only appears when someone has lived with pain for a long time. Dean leaned slightly toward the microphone. "Well," he said softly. The room waited. Dean smiled faintly. "You're right about one thing." Clint tilted his head. Dean continued. "My brother did tell better jokes than me." A few confused chuckles appeared. Dean looked down for a moment. Then he added quietly, "But he also taught me something better." Now the room was completely silent. Dean's voice remained gentle. "He taught me that a man's real strength isn't in how loud he talks." He paused. "It's in how he carries the people he loves." Clint didn't move. Dean looked directly at him. "My brother isn't here anymore," Dean said. "But every time I step on this stage," he tapped his chest, "he's still here." No one laughed. No one moved. The entire room felt the weight of those words. Dean suddenly picked up his glass again and smiled. Besides, he added casually, if he heard your joke tonight. He leaned closer to the microphone. He'd probably tell me to charge you double for the show. The room exploded into laughter. Relief swept across the crowd like a wave. Even Clint laughed at this time. But something had changed. Tension had turned into respect. Dean hadn't attacked, hadn't humiliated Clint. He had simply reminded everyone of something deeper. And Clint Eastwood noticed it. He slowly stood up again. The room quieted once more. Clint raised his glass. Dean, he said. Dean looked down. Clint spoke clearly. That was the calmest comeback I've ever heard. Dean shrugged. That's because I'm too lazy to fight. More laughter. But Clint shook his head. No, he said quietly. That's because you're stronger than most people in this room. The words landed heavily. Dean didn't reply. Instead, he lifted his glass. Two brothers, he said. The entire audience raised their glasses. Two brothers. And the band began to play again. But in that moment, something invisible had shifted between two legends. Quiet understanding. One that neither of them expected that night. And it would lead to something far more powerful in the days to come. Because Clint Eastwood would soon learn that Dean Martin's calm response wasn't just grace, it was a lesson. One that would change the way Clint looked at life forever. And the real story had only just begun. The show ended close to midnight, but the energy inside the Sands Hotel still lingered in the air. The audience slowly filtered out of the lounge, their conversations buzzing with excitement about the performance they had just witnessed. Some people laughed about Dean Martin's jokes. Others talked quietly about the moment when the room had gone silent after Clint Eastwood's comment. Behind the stage, the atmosphere was calmer. Dean Martin walked into his dressing room, still wearing the same relaxed smile he had carried on stage, loosened his tie, poured himself another drink, and sat down in front of the mirror. The lights around the mirror reflected softly in the room, creating a quiet glow. To most people, Dean looked completely unbothered. But when he stared into the mirror, his expression changed slightly. Not angry, not hurt, just thoughtful. Gentle knock interrupted the silence. Dean didn't turn around. Doors open, he said casually. The door slowly creaked open. Clint Eastwood stepped inside. He stood tall in the doorway for a moment, his hands in his pockets, looking slightly uncomfortable. Clint Eastwood was a man known for confidence on screen, but right now, he looked like someone carefully choosing his words. Dean saw his reflection in the mirror and smiled faintly. Well, Dean said, the cowboy found the dressing room. Clint gave a small nod. Hope I'm not interrupting. Dean shrugged. You're only interrupting a man and his whiskey. Clint walked a few steps into the room and closed the door behind him. The hallway noise faded instantly, leaving the room quiet. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Clint broke the silence about what I said out there tonight. Dean gently raised his hand. Relax, Clint. Clint shook his head slightly. No, he said calmly. I should say this. Dean leaned back in his chair and studied him. Clint continued. I didn't know the full story about your brother. I heard something years ago from someone in the business. I thought it was just another old Hollywood story. He paused for a moment. Oh. But when the room went quiet tonight, I realized it wasn't just a joke. Dean remained silent, listening. Clint took a slow breath. I shouldn't have said it. Dean picked up his glass and took a sip. You know something funny? He said. Clint looked at him. Dean turned slightly in his chair. In this business, people say things about you all the time. Half of them are lies. The other half are misunderstandings. Clint nodded slowly. Dean continued. But my brother wasn't part of the business. His voice was calm, but there was weight behind the words. It was just family. Clint lowered his eyes slightly. Hey, that's why I came here, Clint said. Apologize. Dean studied him for a moment. Then he smiled again. The same relaxed smile people saw on stage. Clint, if every man in Hollywood came to apologize for something they said, we'd need a stadium. Clint gave a quiet laugh, but the tension was still there. Dean stood up from his chair and walked toward the small table in the room. He poured another drink and slid the glass across the table toward Clint. Clint hesitated. Dean nodded. It's Vegas. You're allowed. Clint finally picked up the glass. For a moment, both men stood there in silence. Then Clint said something unexpected. Your response out there surprised me. Dean raised an eyebrow. Only surprised you? Clint gave a faint smile. I've spent years around actors, producers, directors, people who explode when someone touches their ego. Dean chuckled softly. And tonight? Clint looked directly at him. You didn't explode. Dean leaned against the table. That's because anger is loud, he said. Clint waited. Dean continued quietly. But grief. He paused slightly. Grief is quiet. The room fell silent again. Clint took a slow sip from his glass. You really loved your brother, Clint said. Dean looked down at his drink. Yeah, he replied simply. There was no dramatic speech. No long explanation. It's just one honest word. Clint set his glass down. You handled that moment better than most men I've ever met, he said. Dean shrugged. My brother used to say something. Clint looked curious. What was that? Dean smiled faintly. He used to say, if someone throws a stone at you, don't throw one back. Clint tilted his head. Why not? Dean lifted his glass again. Because if you're patient, he said, life usually hands them a mirror instead. Clint thought about those words for a moment. Then he laughed quietly. That's a pretty good lesson. Dean smiled. He was full of them. Clint looked at him again, more thoughtfully this time. You know something, Dean? What's that? Clint said slowly. I think tonight your brother would have been proud of you. For a moment, Dean didn't answer, simply lifted his glass slightly. And in a quiet voice, he said, I hope so. Outside the dressing room, the bright lights of Las Vegas continued to glow. But inside that small room, two men who barely knew each other had just shared something far deeper than a joke. And Clint Eastwood was beginning to understand that Dean Martin's calmness wasn't weakness. It was strength shaped by loss, a kind of strength that very few people ever learn. And Clint had a feeling that this night was only the beginning of a story he would remember for the rest of his life. The night at the Sands Hotel slowly faded into the quiet hours of early morning. Most of the casino lights were still glowing, but the crowds had thinned. The laughter and music that filled the building earlier had turned into distant murmurs from a few late gamblers and night workers. Inside the dressing room, Dean Martin and Clint Eastwood were still talking. The mood had shifted from tension to calm conversation. Two glasses sat on the small wooden table, both half empty. Dean leaned comfortably against the wall, while Clint sat in a chair nearby, listening more than speaking. After a few minutes of silence, Clint finally asked the question that had been sitting in his mind all night. Your brother, Clint said quietly. What was he like? Dean looked at the floor for a moment. Not because the question upset him, but because it opened a door to memories he rarely spoke about. Then he gave a small smile. He was the opposite of me, Dean said. Clint raised an eyebrow. How so? Dean chuckled softly. I'm the guy people see on stage, singing, joking, pretending I don't take anything seriously. He paused. My brother was the serious one. Clint leaned forward slightly. Dean continued. He believed in discipline, hard work, responsibility. If he saw me sleeping until noon, he'd shake his head like I was the laziest man alive. Clint smiled faintly. That doesn't sound wrong. Dean laughed quietly. Maybe not. For a moment, the room filled with a comfortable silence. Then Dean looked up again. But he was also the one who believed in me the most. Clint listened carefully. When we were younger, Dean said, I wasn't thinking about music or movies. I was just trying to figure out life. Nothing felt certain. He paused again, remembering. One night, my brother told me something I never forgot. Clint asked softly, what did he say? Dean's voice became quieter. He said, Dean, the world will always have loud people trying to prove they're strong. But the strongest men are the ones who stay calm when the world tries to shake them. Clint nodded slowly. That explains tonight. Dean smiled. Maybe. Clint leaned back in his chair. You know, he said thoughtfully, when I made that joke earlier, I thought it was just part of the show. Dean didn't interrupt. Clint continued. But when you answered the way you did, the whole room changed. It felt like everyone suddenly realized something deeper was happening. Dean looked at him calmly. That's the thing about pain, Dean said. Most people try to hide it. Clint listened carefully. But if you carry it long enough, Dean continued, you start learning from it. Clint thought about those words. And your brother taught you that? Dean nodded slowly. Taught me patience. Dean picked up his glass and turned it gently in his hand. You know, the day he passed away, Dean said quietly, I wanted to punch every wall in the world. Clint remained silent. But then I remembered what he always told me. Dean looked up again. He said anger makes noise, but wisdom makes peace. Clint let out a slow breath. That's a hard lesson to live by. Dean smiled faintly. Yeah, but the older you get, the more you realize something. Clint waited. Life is short, Dean said. Too short to spend it fighting every careless word someone throws at you. Clint nodded slowly. Outside the dressing room, the distant sound of a slot machine echoed faintly through the hallway. Clint stood up from his chair and walked toward the door, but he paused before leaving, turned back toward Dean. You know something, Clint said. What's that? Clint spoke honestly. Tonight I learned more from your calm response than I have from a lot of people in this business. Dean laughed quietly. Well, that's a pretty low bar. Clint smiled. No, he said. It's not. He reached for the door handle, but stopped again. One more thing, Clint added. Dean looked at him. If your brother really believed in staying calm the way you say? Clint gave a small nod. Then he must have been a wise man. Dean lifted his glass slightly. It was Clint. Opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The casino lights reflected softly along the polished floor as he walked away. But his mind stayed on the conversation. For the first time that night, Clint Eastwood understood that Dean Martin's calmness wasn't part of a performance. It was a choice. A choice shaped by loss, memory, and respect for someone who was no longer there. Back inside the dressing room, Dean sat quietly for a moment. He looked at the empty chair Clint had just left. Then he softly whispered to himself, Hope I did all right tonight, brother. The room remained silent. But somehow, Dean felt as if the answer had already been heard. And the final chapter of that unforgettable night was still waiting to unfold. The sun had not yet risen over Las Vegas, but the city was still glowing with its usual quiet energy. The Sands Hotel stood tall on the strip, its lights reflecting off the empty streets that had only a few passing cars at that early hour. Inside the building, the night's excitement had finally faded. The casino floor was calmer now, with only a few gamblers still sitting at the tables. The music had stopped, the stage lights were off. The famous showroom where Dean Martin had performed earlier was completely silent. Dean remained in his dressing room for a while after Clint Eastwood left. He finished the last sip from his glass and slowly stood up. For him, nights like this were nothing new. Decades in show business had taught him how quickly moments came and went. Applause faded. Crowds left. The lights always turned off eventually, but some nights stayed with you. This was one of them. Dean put on his jacket and stepped out into the hallway. The long corridor behind the stage was almost empty. A few workers were quietly cleaning equipment while others packed away instruments from the band. As Dean walked down the hallway, one of the young stage assistants stopped him. Mr. Martin, the young man said respectfully. Dean turned with a friendly nod. Yes, kid. The assistant looked slightly nervous. I just wanted to say, that moment tonight on stage when things got quiet, he hesitated. That was something special. Dean smiled gently. Well, he said, Vegas is full of strange moments. The young man shook his head. No, sir. I've worked here 2 years. I've seen a lot of performers lose their temper when something goes wrong. Dean waited. But you didn't, the assistant continued. You stayed calm. Dean thought for a second, then gave a small shrug. Sometimes staying calm is easier than fighting. The young man nodded, clearly impressed. Well, whatever the reason, people won't forget it. Dean smiled again and continued walking toward the exit. Outside the hotel, the early morning air was cool and quiet. The bright lights of the strip still flickered across the buildings, but the crowds were gone. The city was resting for a few short hours before another night would begin. Near the front entrance, Dean noticed a familiar tall figure standing beside a car. Clint Eastwood. Clint leaned against the car door, looking out at the nearly empty street. When he saw Dean walking toward him, he straightened up. Heading home? Clint asked. Dean nodded, unless someone else plans to make another joke tonight. Clint chuckled softly. I think I've said enough for one evening. They stood there for a moment, the quiet city surrounding them. Clint finally spoke again. You know, Dean, I first walked into your show tonight, I expected entertainment. Dean raised an eyebrow, and Clint looked thoughtful. I didn't expect a lesson. Dean gave a small smile. My brother used to say that life teaches lessons in strange places. Clint nodded slowly. Well, that lesson is going to stay with me. Dean looked at him curiously. Clint continued. In my work, especially in films, people admire the tough guy. The one who reacts fast, fights back, shows strength through anger. Dean leaned against the nearby railing. But tonight, Clint said quietly, you showed something stronger. Dean remained silent, letting him finish. Showed restraint, Clint said. For a moment, the two men simply watched the empty street in front of them. Then Clint turned back toward Dean. I think a lot of people in that room realized something tonight. What's that? Dean asked. Clint answered calmly. That real strength doesn't come from winning an argument. He paused. It comes from knowing when not to start one. Dean smiled at those words. Sounds like you're learning fast, cowboy. Clint laughed. Maybe. He opened the car door but stopped before getting inside. One last thing, Clint said. Dean looked at him. Clint spoke with sincerity. If your brother was watching tonight, I think he would have been proud. Dean didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the horizon where the first faint light of morning was beginning to appear behind the distant mountains. Finally, he nodded once. I hope so, he said quietly. Clint gave him a respectful nod before stepping into the car. The engine started, and the car slowly pulled away from the entrance of the Sands Hotel. Dean stood there for another moment, watching the street grow brighter as the first signs of sunrise appeared. Then he adjusted his jacket and walked toward his own car. Another night in Las Vegas was over. But the story of that night would travel far beyond the casino walls. People would remember the silence, the calm response, and the lesson hidden inside a single moment on stage. A lesson about patience, about respect, and about the quiet strength that comes from remembering the people who shaped us. And somewhere in Dean Martin's heart, one thought remained steady. His brother might not have been there in the room that night, but the wisdom he left behind had filled the entire stage.